We recently attended a webinar that we thought would be of wide interest to our viewers from Finding Petroleum. We've obtained permission to show this on our channel, all about the energy transition and specifically gas demand going forward. 30 minutes long, and then there's a questions and answer session. So I'll hand over to Carl and the guys to introduce themselves. I hope you enjoy it.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar about understanding gas demand up to 2050. My name is Carl Jeffrey from Finding Petroleum in London. So if you work in gas exploration and production, it should be useful to have a better understanding of how gas demand might go up or down over the next 25 years. It's a complex topic because it's a result of interplaying factors and they're all happening at different time scales. And to make a good prediction, we need to know the relative speed all these things will happen. So, for example, demand goes up because of growth in the overall electricity consumption and the decline in the use of coal. And it also goes up if renewables are not being built as fast as the use of coal is declining. We've got two speakers doing a joint presentation. Norrie Stanley is a former Senior Vice President Commercial for Upstream and Gas, Power and Renewables with BP. And he's a co-founder of the RPS Energy Gas Commercial Practice and a major risk reviewer with the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. That's a UK government centre of expertise. And he's joining us today from Woking in Surrey. And John Suller is owner of EPT Energy. They're a commercial training company focusing on gas and renewables industries. And he's a former Director of Capability, Exploration and Production Commercial with BP. And he's based in Aberdeen. So we'll have a joint presentation of about 30 minutes or so, then we'll take your questions. They'll be moderated by David Bamford at the end. And I'd like to invite Norrie and John to start the presentation.
Thank you, Carl. To introduce myself and John, we currently provide courses to Aberdeen and Dundee universities, postgraduates, and to the industry. And we look at sort of commercial issues to do with oil and gas and renewables and power and hydrogen. So just to get started then, gas demand out to 2050 and the impact of the energy transition. So first of all, just to say, what is the transition? The transition in lots of people's minds is a terribly simple thing, which is basically saying, here's where we get energy from. We're very clear that hydrocarbons, coal, and oil and gas are to be eliminated. We like electricity. But of course, you need to make electricity, so that doesn't really count. We sort of like nuclear and hydro. Nuclear, £40 billion for 3 gigawatts in the West Country. And 3 Mile Island is still on people's minds. So nuclear, expensive and dangerous. Hydro, yes, we like hydro, but it floods villages and changes geopolitics. So we're left with wind, solar and hydrogen. And basically, that is the energy transition. People think that the energy transition is about wind, solar and hydrogen and actually the elimination, particularly of fossil fuels, but to some extent the other things as well. And that fundamentalist version flows through into politics and into financing and the banks and lots of push from NGOs and think tanks and so on. So just one final aside on the transition. It's talked about as if this has happened before. It hasn't. All the energy transitions we've had in the past is where you take an existing source of energy like wood and you add coal to it, and then you add oil to it, and then you add gas to it, and then you add renewables to it. In the fundamentalist view, you're actually substituting renewables for all these things. And on the right-hand side, you can see a little chart that BP produced, which was, they would see in the 2020s, even then, you're still adding unabated fossil fuels to the portfolio. And it's after that, if you're going to go to net zero, you need to start substituting it. And the relevance of that is it just tells you how incredibly difficult the transition is going to be. Quick themes. Global energy demand rises because the population grows and economic development. We're saying we should not be looking about or but you need to add renewables into your portfolio. Renewables are intermittent and not nearly as cheap as promoted. The headline news everywhere you look is energy will become much cheaper as the more we depend on renewables. We just think that's not true. Hydrogen is not just hype, but there's a lot of hype involved, and it matters what the colour is. We'll talk about colours in a moment. And then, as Carl said, there's the suite of interactions, heat pumps, lower gas demand, needs more electricity, which needs more gas, hydrogen. How do these things all interact? Nearly everybody actually says that hydrocarbons will have a role even in 2050. And pace is terribly important. The rush to do things affects the supply chain and drives up costs, and things turn up much more slowly than they expect. Very quickly on energy consumption, the main point here is that electricity is going to be the huge growth in demand through to 2050. The electrification of heating and data centers and transportation and hydrogen will all drive up the proportion of demand that comes from electricity. And even data centers, the first go-round of ChatGPT-3 was replaced by ChatGPT-4, and the increase in energy to train it was a 40-fold increase. So data centers, totally out of the blue, really, will require a whole lot more electricity. Gas demand globally in 2024, 4,000 BCMA. So that's the benchmark to measure the future against. 40% power, 20% industry, 25% buildings, chemicals, and a small amount of transport. So 4,000 BCMA. Where does it go? It goes into, as you saw before, into power generation, heat, and chemicals. And if we look at each one in turn, and we look at the risks to gas demand and the opportunities to gas demand in each. So in power generation, huge increase in power generation. Most of that increase will be met by renewables. But renewables are intermittent. So how do you manage intermittency? That will be a role for gas. A lot of power generation is from coal. Coal is tremendously dirty, twice the CO2 capacity of gas. And so displacing coal will be a very important part of getting towards reducing CO2. The next market is heat. As you saw, a lot of gas goes into the heating market. And the domestic market, certainly, the whole issue there is about using electricity and heat pumps as a way of heating homes and industry. And then the final topic is chemicals, and that can be either green hydrogen or blue hydrogen. Green hydrogen from electricity and blue hydrogen from gas. Looking at global electricity, coal is 35% of fuels to power, with gas at 25%. And on the right-hand side, you can see where the coal is being consumed. China is more than 50% consumes more than 50% of the world's coal. The overall demand for coal hasn't declined at all. 2024 was the maximum demand for coal in the history of the world. And China and India focus on coal because it has three very useful components. One is the coal is domestic, and therefore you have lots of security. It has lots of jobs, and it's cheap. And India is planning to increase its coal demand all the way out to 2027. And China has always talked about reducing coal demand, but hasn't done anything about it so far. It will come down, and if gas is available, China will use the gas to replace coal. Electricity generation, this is just to illustrate that depending on how much electricity demand increases, nearly all of the growth will be met by renewables. This is BP's forecast. The current trajectory shows a big increase in renewables and some increase in gas. And in the larger one, it's a big increase in renewables and a very small reduction in gas. So electricity generation growth will come from renewables. But there are issues. Renewables are all intermittent, and electricity demand is instantaneous. So there's a problem. The generation is in a different location, and so you need to have a new grid. And the world's investment in electricity grids will be absolutely astronomical. And then renewables have very high capital costs and very low operating costs. And so you need to manage, if you have a power system where the day-to-day costs are done on marginal costs, then the wind farms wouldn't actually cover their capital costs. So the mechanism for managing that are the so-called contracts for differences, and we'll look at each of these three things separately. So this is what intermittency looks like. And this was looking at last November. And the chart here is the percentage of supply from each of the fuels. So at the bottom is nuclear, and then in orange is gas, and then wind is blue, solar is yellow. There's biomass, which is mainly the Drax power station burning wood from America. And then there's a certain amount of toing and froing on the interconnectors from Europe. And you can see here at the beginning of November, wind and solar were only 4% and gas was 60%. And by the 10th, gas was still more than 50% and wind and solar was less than 10. And yet on the 17th, wind was 50% and gas was balancing. And you can see that the wind is incredibly erratic, and the gas-fired plant has to be flexible enough to respond. So you take the wind if you've got it, and if you haven't got it, you need to run the gas-fired plant, and the nuclear runs constantly at the bottom. So there are long periods with no or low wind, and especially true in the winter when electricity demand is high. Solar in Northern Europe, you can see how tiny the little yellow flashes are. And of course, demand is peak in February, 7 o'clock, and no matter how sunny it's been, there's no contribution when it's dark. And you do occasionally hear things saying, well, if we need 100 units of wind, if we install 120 units of wind, then that will cover intermittency. It doesn't. When it's not windy, it's not working. But it's always blowing somewhere. And actually, no, it isn't. The wind generation across the UK is quite highly correlated. In February, if you have a big high it comes over the whole of Europe. It's very cold. There's not much solar because it's northern hemisphere and dark, and there's no wind. And that can last for weeks. And the volume of energy is colossal. There's no question of using batteries to fill that. And in fact, just as an illustration, in Germany, on 6th of November, in that same period we're looking at before, wind and solar was just a few percent. And they were depending on coal for 35% of their demand, and imports for about 25%, which came from nuclear, which they had rejected because of political problems. It came from nuclear in France and from coal-fired power in Poland. And there was this very unattractive photograph showing the wind farm in Germany being knocked down so they could get at the coal underneath. I mean, that's just not good policy. So intermittency, a big issue and hard to handle. The next one is the grid and how the grid works. So in the past, you had only a small number of power generating equipment, all of it onshore and all connected to a relatively simple grid. If you install lots of wind farms, then you need to have a much more distributed grid and you need to invest hugely in order to bring that on. And the investment that the grid is saying we need to do by 2030 is more than £30 billion, probably about £35 billion. And by 2050, which is on the right-hand side, the extra coloured dots, all far away from demand, an extra 50 billion by 2040. A lot of the offshore equipment will be high voltage DC equipment, which you have to get in the queue to acquire. The national operator said the 30 billion by 2030 will be challenging. This is civil servant code for this will not happen. It seems to be not noticed that 2030 is actually only 5 years away, and it can take 10 years to get the planning sorted and the construction of any grid system. So that's a huge investment that's not counted in the renewables are cheap calculation. And then just a quick final point on how renewables are priced. because, as I said, you have this problem about their marginal costs are very low, but their capital costs are very high. So what you agree is a contract for difference. And so in this example here, you agree that the wind farm will be paid £70 per megawatt hour for all the electricity it produces. If the market price is below, it gets topped up. And if the market price is above, then it pays that back. So it has a guaranteed £70 per megawatt hour. And the mechanism is done through rounds of auctions. So the first auction was in 2017. You have to be careful about the numbers that are quoted because they're all quoted in 2012 prices. In 2017, it looked like about £75 a megawatt hour, but actually, with inflation, that's more than 100. Prices went down in 2019. They went down a little bit in 2022, although quite a lot of the 2022 projects didn't go ahead subsequently because their costs had risen. There wasn't a successful auction in 23. Nobody was willing to bid. And in 24, the prices were set at £82 per megawatt hour. And that £82 per megawatt compares with the 2024 average price of electricity set by gas prices of £75 per megawatt hour. So even the additions in 24 were more expensive than a gas price set electricity from 2024. This is the consequence of the CFDs. And you can see when gas prices went up eightfold in the 2022-23 period, there were some payments from the wind farms to the government. But overall, even by 2024, we're talking about £240 million of payments a month from the government, or actually from the consumer to the producers. And, it sort of looks like a subsidy to me. So it's not obvious that the wind farms are as cheap as you would hope. So, electricity summary. Electricity demand globally will increase 50 to 100% by 2050. In the UK, it's expected to increase by 50% to 2035 and then to 100% by 2050. Gas needs to displace coal globally, particularly in China, where the coal demand continues to be huge. Renewable costs include the CFDs and the intermittency cover and the grid upgrades. The three things combined mean renewables will not be cheap. And there's no point in waving your arms, as the government is doing, and saying the way to have cheap electricity is to fill up our system just with renewables. You need to do it. Renewables will expand hugely because if we're committed to reducing climate change, you'll need renewables, but it won't be cheap. CFDs plus intermittency plus the grid upgrades, not a cheap process. And gas's market share will be around the same as it is now, all the way out to 2050. Hydrogen. So, the most abundant element in the universe. It's when you use it, you end up with heat or electricity and just water. And that's just unbelievably fabulous. And as an abundant element, what's not to like? But hydrogen is an energy carrier. It's not a source of energy. I mean, totally obvious, but not widely understood. Different flavors, different colors. Nearly all hydrogen currently produced is grey, so that's natural gas is reformed, but without CCS. You can add CCS to it, carbon capture, and you get blue hydrogen. And if you use your electricity and electrolysis, you have green hydrogen. So green and blue hydrogen are the colours to think of in the future. And the total demand for electricity, for hydrogen, is about just over 100 million tonnes a year, of which 40% for refining, ammonia is 30%, methanol 15%, and a small amount into metals. So again, remember the 110 million tonnes per annum of grey hydrogen produced now. An enormous enthusiasm for hydrogen. It's thought of as a magic bullet. All you need is to have enough wind and solar to produce surplus electricity, question mark about what that means, turn that into hydrogen, clean burning fuel, it's obviously the future. These dots here show the number of projects that have been announced in 2023 and 2024. And for example, the German government is saying, yes, we're going to invest 19 billion euros in a nationwide pipeline network, but without being clear about where you're going to get the hydrogen from, or what you're going to use it for, and who the customers might be, and what the arrangements might be. Only about 5% of the projects that are slated to be on stream by 2030 have got to FID. Nearly everything is an announcement. And so this enthusiasm is not being backed up by activity. It is potentially a huge distraction. Characteristics of hydrogen: it's an energy carrier. You need to make it. It will have less energy than the fuel. The small molecule is absolutely horrible to handle. It can work its way through a metal matrix and in brittle pipelines. It's hard to contain. It will leak. It has a very low energy density. Natural gas is 3 times more energy dense than hydrogen by volume, so you have to compress it to 12,000 psi. It takes lots of energy, and you have to put it in vessels that will handle 12,000 psi, or you could liquefy it to minus 252 degrees centigrade. Again, consumes lots of energy. It actually consumes quite a lot of energy, even transporting it through pipelines. It's 3 times more difficult to transport through a pipeline than natural gas. Much more explosive than gas, but hydrogen is well managed in industrial contexts. So there's no reason you can't use hydrogen in the way that it's currently used. But if you're going to use it in different things like buses and so on, you need to think carefully about how does this explosivity work. And there is a climate change impact. It's not a climate change gas, but if it escapes into the environment, which it will do because it's hard to contain, it affects the other climate change gases and amplifies their effect. So the conversation is all about what could we do with hydrogen, and this is a suite of things, from domestic heating to transport to electricity for the intermittency, for refining, and for chemicals. And the 2 flavors, renewable from hydrolysis or gas with CCS. So heat blending one you'll see a lot of, which is that we can blend 20% of hydrogen into the natural gas pipeline. And here's just the obvious thing to do. You take your surplus electricity, you convert it into hydrogen, and then you inject it into the natural gas pipeline. But it actually, a 20% blend only reduces the CO2 by 6 to 7% because it has such low energy density. And there are lots of technical issues about how you could actually do that with lots of electrolyzers and multiple injection points and whole issue of economies of scale. So I think the market for this will only be if you have surplus hydrogen from other sources. Maybe you could use that as a last resort sink for the hydrogen. The way you do heating is you use heat pumps. They have an efficiency of 300%. Hydrogen in this process will be less than 50%. So there's 6 times advantage to using the electricity to run heat pumps rather than generate hydrogen. Transportation, the problem with hydrogen is you have to make it, and you have to transport it, and you have to compress it, and you have to turn it into something else. So in transportation, you start with electricity, 100 kilowatts, you turn it into hydrogen, you compress it or liquefy it, you deliver it, and then you put it back through a fuel cell, and you end up with 20 units. So an 80% loss across the system. A battery, you end up with 70%, a 30% loss. So battery cars have won. Toyota still are talking about hydrogen cars. That's never going to happen. Hydrogen vans, no, that'll never happen. Heavy trucks, maybe. They talk about airplanes. I did see in Farnborough there were 2 or 3 companies developing liquid hydrogen airplanes. I mean, minus 252 degrees, just appalling. So for transportation, it's going to be a very limited market. And then using the power to hydrogen to back to power, you have the same problem. You have to have electrolyzers, then you have to do compression and storage, then you have to transport it, a fuel cell, a round trip efficiency of 30%. And again, there are lots of technical issues about intermittency of renewable energy and the utilization of the electrolyzers, which absolutely hate intermittency. And then you probably need to store the hydrogen. And then, of course, you need to find places where the hydrogen is convenient to do. So again, it's a possibility, but it's not going to be a serious market. So of the possible markets for hydrogen, then domestic heating only as a last resort. For transport, maybe ships, I don't know. Backup intermittency. If you're going to do hydrogen, then blue hydrogen is preferable, much more controllable. Refining and heat applications, again, you do these in clusters with chemicals. So you don't transport it through a 9,000 kilometer pipeline system, as the Germans are proposing to do. You actually build your hydrogen, gas to hydrogen with CCS power plants, with a refinery, with an ammonia and methanol plant, do things in a cluster. You can manage then continuous supply that these processes need. The intermittency of renewables is fatal to most of these applications. And this finally on hydrogen, this is McKinsey's view of the markets for hydrogen. Dark blue is 35, light blue is 2050, and they come down with, just as you'd expect, chemicals, refining, maybe some road transport, maybe some heating, but a huge range of possibilities. So in power, it's between 3 and 100. And I think a more sensible outlook would be a thing that said by 2035, we're talking about going from 100 to 150. And by 2050, it goes from 100 to 200. And that's mainly in chemicals. So the opportunities for gas, as demand rises, there's increased electrification, the growth is provided by renewables, gas displaces coal and provides cover for intermittency. Heat pumps will displace gas in some markets, but not all. And then hydrogen should be focused on chemicals, refining, and some industrial processes, with gas and electricity competing to provide the hydrogen. And forecasts say it will be a third, 2/3. Some of them say it will be 2/3 blue, and some say 2/3 green. We think that blue hydrogen will be more realistic. So overall gas demand, nearly there. These are various forecasts. TSE is my favorite analyst company, very thoughtful. They see a big increase in demand, although they've actually recently reduced their 2050 number to 6,000 because they think the displacement of coal will be slower. And that's a whole issue here about how quickly all this transformation will happen. But mostly people are saying gas demand will rise from through the 2020s and the 2030s. You will end up with a number like 5,000 BCMA being the sort of central case for most views. McKinsey, for example, are saying it's probably between 300 and 500. So sort of around about 500, and that gas would go to power, chemicals, industry, and blue hydrogen. So takeaways: continuous rise in global energy demand underpinned by population growth and economic expansion. Behind that, there's an assumption that energy efficiency, which has improved at 2% a year till now, will accelerate to 4% per year from now on. I mean, it's a big assumption. Gas demand will increase to the 2040s. Most gas will come from new projects. LNG is expected to more than double by 2050. It's expected to go up by 50% by 2030. That's in 5 years' time, a 50% increase in LNG. And then the demonization of fossil fuels is problematic in that, and John will talk about that in a moment. And the sustainable energy scenario, gas needs to be cleaner. The methane leakage is a disgrace. And gas has no claim to be a clean fuel if the methane is not sorted. There needs to be a shift from coal to gas, the expansion of wind, where windy, and solar, where sunny, as part of an energy portfolio, which includes fossil fuels, hydro, nuclear. Demand management will be a big topic for the future, and some storage. Deploy gas with CCS and expand blue and green hydrogen, but do it thoughtfully and don't have the wild and unthinking enthusiasm which we've seen so far. Do it with minimal fundamentalism.
We see a lot of sort of evangelical views of young people in terms of the future of energy and the transition. Dieter Helmer's observed, energy professor at Oxford, that the level of CO2 has increased every year over 29 COPs. We're not actually having any effect. When we look at the uncertainty in the forecasts in the demand for gas, Norrie and I inquired, well, why is there such a range? And over the last 3 years, that range has narrowed. So the high side case and the low side case. And what was driving this range of uncertainty, which is so difficult to plan in, was these issues underlying the role of gas in electrification and the role of hydrogen. And that's why we've focused our work on trying to explain to young people that these evangelical views of hydrogen and renewables have to be challenged to get them more realistic. And the bottom line is the demand going forward for gas is beginning to consolidate around gas being sustained and in fact growing. I think the key point at the end, as Norrie mentioned, demonization of hydrocarbons, I think that has now changed, possibly as a result of the election in the US, seeing the wind blow in a new direction, but more likely through a realization when you dig into the hydrogen, you dig into the pace of electrification, that this is not going to work at the pace people see. And that is flowing now into the reality of finance, where only last week, a number of US banks and private equity houses have withdrawn from the climate alliance initiatives, which has been putting unrealistic boundaries around investment. So bottom line, I think, is reality is beginning to win out in this whole debate.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so we're open to questions. If you'd like to put questions in the Q&A box. Thanks. You've given a lot of depth to a lot of things that I guess we all know the outline of, but brought in a lot more. I'll just shove in that I also do a magazine in shipping where there's a massive enthusiasm for blue ammonia, just change and more realism. But I shall pass over to David.
Yeah, I mean, let me ask a couple of questions in a particular way. If the UK stays on its current trajectory, and you use some adjectives to describe the UK's current trajectory, and the EU for that matter, if there's no change, and obviously my next question would be, what should the change be? But if there's no change, where will we finish up in 5 years' time, do you think?
Well, I think what will not happen is that the grid expansions will be available in 5 years' time. And there are some solar plants which have gone for grid connection, have been told already that it's 2034. And there are places in West London that you can't build houses because the grid is already consumed by data centers. So the bad outcome will be one where there's a big expansion of wind in Scotland and not a big expansion of the transportation system, the grid system. And you end up with lots and lots of investment in wind that actually doesn't work by 2030. And the race for 2030 has all sorts of implications in the supply chain and getting the right mix of things. And we will end up with a much more expensive system where we'll still have lots of gas, lots more wind than we need. Miliband has just announced that this year's wind auction will be the biggest ever. And we'll see what the price is. But the contract for differences price isn't that different from the price that's set in the grid by the normal price for gas. And there's much talk about, well, if we have renewables, then we don't have all this volatility. Well, we could contract for gas other than on the spot market, as China does, and it buys its LNG on 20-year contracts. And so it doesn't have the same volatility of gas prices. And of course, it was their gas that came to Europe and saved the day after Ukraine shut down. So a bad outcome would be a massive investment in stuff that doesn't work. And that's the danger for 2030. If we had 2035 as the target, as it was, then an orderly development of renewables and the grid and the contract for differences system would be a possibility.
Okay. So expanding the timescales. I know we have 5 questions on board now, so I'm going to turn to them. But so what you're saying is, for the UK, expanding the timescales, going to long-term contracts for LNG, actually, and presumably we need to do better on gas storage because, compared with almost any way you care to name, our gas storage is small.
Yes, it's tiny. France and Germany will probably have 60, 90 days of storage. We have 5.
I think gas service will be key as we start to see intermittency of the renewables increasing on the system. The gas power stations, we have 50 currently, mostly CCGTs, they're going to have to operate at a much wider range of load factor. They currently operate in the high 60s. It underpins their capital efficiency economics. They're going to start operating in the low 20s, and hence the supply of gas when it's needed, not on a continuous basis, which relates to your point, David, about storage. I think one of the risks we'll see is the pace is too quick, and a lot of gas stations need to be decommissioned. They're like nuclear stations getting to the level of their design, the age limits of their design. And the forward passage of putting in new gas stations, will they be efficient CCGTs or hydrogen CCGTs, or will they just be simple open cycle gas turbines? It's a very integrated decision around how we use gas and the need for service, in other words, modulation in gas supplies.
And I think that sort of sensible examination of the portfolio need is not helped by the evangelical thrust that all we need is more renewables and more hydrogen.
So just turning to some of the questions, we have 3 sort of linked on CCS, carbon capture and storage, to deal with the gas burn and increased gas burn, actually, that you're talking about. So one is, how much CCS do you expect? The next one is really, if you start looking at CCS, there's no getting away from the fact that at the moment it's kind of subsidized. I think I said as we warmed up, I had a ex-colleague who now works at Exxon say, Exxon are convinced that the only way CCS works is if it's used for an enhanced oil recovery, which might give Mr. Miliband a certain pause. And there's a lot of costs and uncertainty with CCS. And what do you think about that? I mean, is the CCS itself? I mean, I remember when BP set off down its gas is great, and we're going to have power associated with CCS. It sounded like a really good story 6 or 7 years ago. Are you convinced by the carbon capture and storage story at the moment that it's going to be economic and priced well enough that it's actually going to do what we want it to do? If I can make that question simple.
Well, I think the question of economics sort of depends on, it's obviously going to be cheaper to run the gas-fired plant without CCS. So the economics are, and this is of course as a consequence of going for net zero. You're going to increase your costs because you're going to have to capture the carbon which you didn't bother about before. And so it's driven by either subsidies and or the price of carbon, because the externality of simply dumping the carbon into the atmosphere, is a real cost. It's just nobody's bearing it. So if we look at a CCS that is not EOR, and you look at Sleipner, one of the other Norwegian projects, that works out about 70 euros a ton of CO2 captured. And that compares pretty well with the cost of carbon that's in the European and the UK systems, which is sort of between 70 and 100. Other CCS projects have not worked as well, and they have been more expensive. The one in the UK, where we gather the carbon dioxide from a number of producers, and then supply it to to a transportation and storage company, is commercially incredibly complicated. And there's lots of volume risk and so on. And so that has actually got subsidies. The Treasury's view is, well, as long as the cost of carbon is high enough, then those subsidies will peter out. So we won't be paying them for 20 years. So it's not economic if you don't care about climate change. It's economic if you have a carbon price in the range of 100 euros a ton.
100 euros a ton.
Yeah.
Okay, but not 70.
Well, 70 to 100. It just depends on how well the Norwegians, as usual, have implemented their project terribly well. So the economic driver is the cost of carbon. If there's no cost of carbon, then it's not worth doing. If there is a cost of carbon, then if it's the right level, then you would do CCS. And what you will actually do is in your cluster, if you're doing this thing in a more orderly way, is you would build new gas-fired plant in the cluster with the chemicals and refining and everything else and carbon capture all in one place. All of this absolutely loves economies of scale.
The other thing that does, Norrie, is get rid of all the planning issues that people who are trying to do long distance carbon CO2 transport are bumping into. They find there are 20 planning applications between point A, where the CO2 starts, and point B, where you want to get it to. And if you go down the cluster route, that's much more. Well, that particular problem goes away. Yeah.
Yes. Well, and you have economies of scale.
Yeah.
So the cluster route, although commercially potentially much more complicated, is and the same will be true. You make your hydrogen in the cluster.
Yeah.
So you don't need 1,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipeline as in Germany. And the European proposals are, well, whole areas, big areas would be all connected with hydrogen pipelines. Clusters will be the answer for the next 15 years at least.
Yeah, but it does sound like you're saying, even with that, there's a cost that will be transmitted to the consumer, and therefore it's very unlikely that electricity prices are going to go down.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes. The government claimed that there'd be a £300 reduction in electricity price for the consumer.
Yeah.
They're not saying that anymore. They are saying it will be less volatile. Well, okay, I'm not sure that's true either. And then they produced, they lent on the national system operator to produce a report that said it won't be any more expensive than simply having gas-fired power, and all of that has been totally laughed at by everybody that's read the reports.
I must remind myself to look on Companies House, who is the only shareholder in the NESO or whatever it's called.
Yeah,
I think it may be the same guy who doesn't like the answer.
You don't really need to go to Companies House. I think you'll find that that's the case. And I think that's why they said that the investment in the grid in the 5 years, 5 years to 2030, that investment in the grid is doable but challenging. No sensible
But
person would say that.
they also added in to the press releases that the renewables would be cheaper than the alternative, the counterfactual, as returned in the report. But that was justified by assuming a carbon price of $147 a tonne and a gas price of 100 pence a therm. Both are double realistic numbers. And it's this kind of putting out numbers to give an answer that is better than gas, that is actually preventing progress to do things that will reduce carbon. As I said at the start, we haven't reduced carbon in global emissions through 29 COPs, and we need more realism. So I'm picking up your point about CCS. CCS for BP started as, we don't know the price of carbon, let's do it as an EOR scheme. And I think globally, recent announcements in the Tangguh plant, a CCS project, is actually grounded in allowing production of associated gas with a high CO2 content, removing the CO2 and injecting it back into the reservoir for recovery. And we see the same in Abu Dhabi in the Upper Zakum reservoir. And now they're confident that gas flooding hasn't reduced reserves. They actually want the gas short for power generation in the UAE. They're using CO2 as a flood. So globally, gas CCS is best associated with enhanced recovery to make it less sensitive to the pricing of carbon. Otherwise, it will remain a subsidy-seeking activity.
I agree with that. Let me change tack. You took, and Richard Herbert is asking this question. You changed tack a bit, for me to change tack. You covered a bit the role of gas in domestic supply, and the fact is, we have a pretty ancient housing stock in the UK still, unlike, say, Germany, where lots and lots of people use gas for cooking, heating, etc. How do you see that working out in the UK of tomorrow? There seems to be an interminable discussion about heat pumps versus hydrogen. How do you see that?
Well, I think it's heat pumps versus gas.
Right.
We could say hydrogen in that context doesn't make any sense at all.
Agreed.
Hydrogen in your home, it's easily handled industrially. Would you have it in your home? You have to make it. So hydrogen doesn't feature at all. The only way to decarbonize heating of houses is through heat pumps. And heating of houses is quite a large consumption of energy. And so what we will need is probably a new version of heat pumps that run hotter, because the main problem is that they don't run very hot. And if you don't have underfloor heating in a well-insulated house, Norway, their houses are all fed by heat pumps. Even although it's terribly cold in Norway, that still works because they don't really need much heating. So there was some work done on changing the fluid in the heat pump, which would allow it to operate at at least 10 degrees hotter, and then it would look more like your gas boiler. But it won't be cheaper. And again, this is the thing. Climate change, there are lots of bodies, including the Climate Change Committee, who are sort of basically saying you can move to a no-carbon future at virtually no expense. That just won't be true. And so you install your heat pump, it's a lot more expensive than gas. The operating costs, although it's 3 times more efficient, electricity costs 3 times more than gas. and so the operating costs will be similar. So the trick with all these things is how do you explain to people that for more money you will get something that's worse, and then sign up for it. And I mean, one way the government does it is compulsion, and the other way is subsidies. So you get £7,000 off your heat pump at the moment, which saves you quite a lot of money. But that's really the choice. It's gas or heat pumps.
So I think that's going to be a dilemma, because there are a lot of circumstances where communal heat pumps, and actually wider than heat pumps, because communal heating systems will work. But with the housing stock that we have in the UK, to see it being completely replaced by electricity is just unreasonable. We're going to need gas and a gas system, but not a gas system that's converted to transport hydrogen for the reasons we've explained. But there will be an ongoing demand for gas, I see, for well into 2040s, because there isn't an ability to convert everyone over, especially with the high electricity prices, which leads to an issue, I think, which is as gas demand drops, gas prices are going to fall, which makes it even harder to convert over to higher price electricity. It will affect each other, demand and price.
I mean, one of the small things you can do, and again, it's not been done, and you just wonder why, is that if you have your gas boiler and you have a hot water tank with the right electronics and your smart meter, you can heat your hot water with electricity when there's a surplus. And so you reduce the gas demand for bulk heating because it doesn't heat the water anymore. And that would be a trivial thing to do, and yet. So the
hybrid answer.
Implementation of things quickly across millions of households is difficult.
Mm-hmm. So, sort of picking up that theme, but in a completely different way. And Carla Bashaglia asked a component of this thing, but it's still true that there are 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that don't have recourse to adequate energy. Whether it's lighting, cooking capabilities, using wood instead of something cleaner. Women in the family having to walk miles to gather wood, all that sort of thing. If you were to, and this is a sort of NJ Ayuk question, I think, if you were to say to sub-Saharan countries, this is the route you should take, what would it be?
Well, I think,
would you say, well, it's very sunny, put solar panels everywhere, or what would you do?
No, I think it would be to recognize the issue of intermittency. Even with solar, you have the nighttime issue. Until we crack large storage of solar, you're going to need an integrated system of renewables plus a backup supply. And in so much of the developing South, they have natural resources. We don't want to see coal developed, but the development of gas integrated with solar, not demonized out of a system, but as part of a system that is optimized, remembering that solar and wind particularly is 6 times the capital per effective megawatt hour. So, we have a lot of students coming into the universities who are from the developing South. They have the natural resources, a just transition. They have the right to exploit those resources. The idea that we don't teach petroleum engineering anymore because it's a bad industry is crazy. We should be helping them develop their capability to develop their resources and gas in a very responsible way. So my answer would be an integrated approach rather than a fundamentalist evangelical approach. All right.
Well, and I think just to pick up this thing about, particularly in Africa, the demand, the supply of energy per person is low. that's where the bulk of the 2 billion people by 2050 will appear. And they currently consume a 40th per head that an American does. And so the idea that the demand for electricity, for energy, will flatten off after 2040 just seems to be totally out of balance with the reality. These people will need, some energy, even if they end up only getting a tenth of what an American consumes. That will be a lot of extra energy. Locally, I mean, solar plus a battery has been a boon for villages where you can charge your mobile phones, and an efficient means of burning the wood is now available. I mean, there are small steps that can be done that will be transformational, but systems. I mean, the expectation is that heat pumps will be developed in Europe, and gas will simply be used for heating in the south.
Okay. I'm going to take one final question. I'm sorry there's a few I've not picked up, but I'm kind of intrigued by Manusha Takin's question, which is picking up your thing about hydrocarbons are being unfairly demonized. And he says, however, the investors seem not to agree, as BP shares indicate. I think maybe BP shares performance is a different sort of demonization, personally. But the other day, I asked a couple of people, who work in investment research, how many investors do they come across? So they work covering, a lot of the companies that are active in the UK and elsewhere in E&P. And I said, how many investors are there that would currently think of investing in oil and gas? And they said, without hesitation, none. So we seem to have a problem that we've not yet figured out how to answer.
Oh, and we undoubtedly don't. I mean, so there was a whole lot of movement about, we need to make sure that the investment companies, the banks and the pension funds don't invest in tobacco, defense and fossil fuels. And they paraded this policy. Each bank would stand up and say, yes, we decided against that. Now, of course, defense has come off that list for obvious reasons. And as John was saying, very recently, lots of the banks have come off that position too. But of course, people are tainted by the idea that the fossil fuels are doomed. Why would you invest as a person? Why would you go into that industry when it's going to last only a few more years and then it'll be over? And so it goes back to the very first slide, which was about the future of energy. The transition is about wind, solar, and hydrogen, and you don't really need to worry about anything else. And that's
Whereas
totally
the mood that's coming out of the US now, and forget, I don't mean forget what Trump says, but forget what, think more about what people like Chris Wright, his Secretary of State, say. Actually the important things are energy security, energy availability, energy price. And those are the important things, not all the rest of the stuff.
I mean, the advantage that the US is going to have, and currently has, in its energy, gas costs $2.50, and in Europe it's I don't know, $8.
Another number.
Another number.
3 times.
And so it's just a fantastic advantage. And so Europe will continue to deindustrialize because its energy costs are far too high. And America will be an incredible powerhouse. I mean, it's shocking.
And David, I think picking up your point about investment, we think of the investment coming out of the banks, etc., out of the West. Increasingly, investment is going to come out of the sovereign wealth funds. the resource-producing nations. And you've seen the creation of XRG in Abu Dhabi, the ADNOC creating a gas and renewables company with some friends of ours formerly involved. That's an example of large amounts of money that are coming out of the Abu Dhabi National Wealth Fund.
Yeah, now to the Middle East in general.
Yes, and being invested globally. It's not just invested in Middle East resource production.
Yeah, so Qatar,
if the West won't...
Yeah, no, absolutely. Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Saudi,
Yes,
lots of money.
That's right.
Yeah. I think with that, thank you, guys. I know I've not fielded all the questions. I'm sorry for anybody who feels completely left out, but I think I'll hand back to Carl now.
Well, thank you very much, Norrie, John and David. I think you've given us great insights on a subject which one of the most important subjects in the world. So thanks very much. So hopefully you'll join us again next Friday. We're going to hear about gas supply and the gap between supply and demand from Mike Simmons and Halliburton. That's it from us, and we'll see you next week. Have a good weekend. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you, gentlemen. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. I hope you found that interesting. Please hit the like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Hope to see you back on our channel before too long. Bye for now.